The tension in the CNN debate studio felt like static clinging to every breath. Denzel Washington adjusted the microphone clipped to his dark suit, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp, taking in every flicker of the audience's restless energy. Just a few feet away, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known to millions as AOC, sat angled toward him, her trademark calm unbroken even as she flipped through her thick stack of notes. The moderator, Anderson Cooper, cleared his throat. Anderson Cooper said, "Tonight, we have with us Oscar-winning actor and activist Denzel Washington and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for what we hope will be a frank and civil exchange about freedom of speech and the limits of political dissent." Denzel gave a polite nod, though his jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. AOC folded her hands, a tight smile crossing her face. The cameras panned across the packed audience, a mixture of students, community leaders, and reporters, all bracing for what they sensed would be anything but civil. Anderson Cooper turned first to Denzel. Anderson Cooper said, "You've spoken out recently about your belief that dissenting voices, especially artists, are being silenced by political institutions. Can you explain what you mean?" Denzel Washington leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Denzel Washington said, "When people disagree with the party line, they get labeled, dismissed, or threatened. I've seen it in Hollywood. I've seen it in community meetings. I've seen it in the way the media spins the truth. That's not democracy. That's intimidation." A faint murmur rippled through the audience. AOC lifted her chin, her fingers drumming lightly on her notes. AOC said, "With all due respect, Denzel, we should be careful not to confuse accountability with censorship. People who spread misinformation or hate speech often hide behind free speech. That's not dissent. That's reckless." Denzel didn't flinch. Denzel Washington said, "And who decides what's reckless, Congresswoman? You? Congress? The media corporations that pick who gets airtime and who doesn't." Anderson Cooper interjected quickly, sensing the temperature spike. Anderson Cooper said, "Let's remember, we're here to debate ideas, not each other." But Denzel's eyes never left AOC's. Denzel Washington said, "I'm not attacking you. I'm telling you, everyday people, not just actors, but teachers, truck drivers, single parents. They're sick of being told to shut up when they don't repeat the right slogans." AOC's voice turned slightly sharper, but her tone stayed even. AOC said, "No one is telling everyday people to shut up. What I'm saying is that when influential figures spread conspiracies or target vulnerable communities, there have to be consequences." The audience murmured again, a few scattered claps, but the tension stayed coiled like a spring. Denzel sat back, folding his hands, but his stare cut through the lights and the polite stage decor. Denzel Washington said, "That's the problem right there. Consequences. Who decides those consequences, Congresswoman? Who makes that list of what we're allowed to say?" AOC opened her folder, her eyes flicking across the printed quotes. AOC said, "Since you bring up lists, Denzel, I think it's fair to point out that your recent comments have been used to prop up people who push real conspiracy theories. When you talk about shadow powers and secret elites, it gives cover to people who use that language to spread hate." Denzel's expression turned cold. Denzel Washington said, "I talk about powerful people making decisions in the dark that hurt working folks. That's not a conspiracy. That's history. That's reality." Anderson Cooper shifted in his chair, eyes darting between the two. Anderson Cooper said, "Okay, let's pause for a moment. Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, would you say you believe the government should play a stronger role in monitoring what people say online?" AOC didn't miss a beat. AOC said, "I believe that platforms and the government should do more to stop disinformation that destroys lives. But that's not the same as silencing dissent. The difference is accountability." Denzel leaned forward again, the edge in his voice unmistakable. Denzel Washington said, "You call it accountability. I call it silencing. And I promise you this, we won't be silenced. Not by you. Not by anyone. The audience gasped, the weight of his words settling over every row. The camera caught AOC's eyes narrowing, her jaw clenching as she set her folder down with a quiet but deliberate thud. What started as a polite debate was now a powder keg waiting for a spark, and both of them knew exactly where to strike next. The seconds after Denzel's declaration stretched out like a taut wire ready to snap. The studio lights felt hotter, the quiet thicker, as if everyone inside that room realized they'd just crossed an invisible line between polite debate and something raw. AOC's eyes didn't leave Denzel's. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, the folder now pushed aside like it was dead weight. Her voice was calm, but the tightness around her mouth said everything about how close she was to letting her famous composure crack. AOC said, "Denzel, you want to talk about being silenced? Try being a woman of color in politics. Try being doxxed, threatened, or told to go back where you came from every single day. Don't lecture me about who gets to speak." Denzel Washington didn't flinch. His eyes held hers, unblinking, as if he'd prepared his entire life for this moment. Denzel Washington said, "And yet you're here, Congresswoman. Millions of followers, national press, big donors. You're not silenced, you're amplified." Meanwhile, the factory worker who says the wrong thing online loses his job overnight. The grandmother who posts something you don't like gets called a terrorist. Who's standing up for them? A small cluster in the audience clapped, but it died quickly in the hush that followed. Anderson Cooper leaned in, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. Anderson Cooper said, "Congresswoman, how do you respond to that? Do you think there's any truth to the idea that political correctness can silence ordinary people?" AOC's lips twitched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. AOC said, "Political correctness is just respect, Anderson. And there's a difference between respect and letting bigotry flourish. Let's not pretend they're the same." Denzel's laugh was short, sharp. It startled the front row. He gestured out to the studio audience, his voice booming louder than the sound system could contain. Denzel Washington said, "Respect is earned, Congresswoman. You don't get to call people bigots just because they don't repeat your script word for word. You don't get to bury people's livelihoods just because they ask the wrong questions." AOC's eyes glinted like sharpened glass under the lights. AOC said, "You think standing up to hate speech is about scripts? Maybe the problem is that you think there's no line, that it's all just free speech, no matter who gets hurt." Denzel jabbed a finger on the table. Once, twice, like a gavel pounding a verdict no one could overrule. Denzel Washington said, "And maybe the problem is people like you deciding which speech is worth protecting. You don't get to do that. None of you do." Anderson Cooper raised a hand like a traffic cop at a runaway intersection. Anderson Cooper said, "Let's not talk over each other." But the tension had its own momentum now, and neither of them was slowing down. AOC's voice rose, no longer just measured points from a briefing binder. It was the voice that had carried her through protests and press ambushes, and it wasn't about to back down. AOC said, "So what's your solution, Denzel? You stand up here saying, 'We won't be silenced,' but you won't even admit that free speech comes with responsibility. You can't have it both ways." Denzel Washington's answer was almost a whisper, but it hit harder than if he'd shouted. Denzel Washington said, "The responsibility is to listen, even when it makes you uncomfortable." That line cracked something open in the audience. There were gasps, even a soft yes, from somewhere in the back rows. But others looked away, uneasy, as if realizing they'd signed up for a debate about policy, but now found themselves staring into a mirror reflecting the cost of shutting each other down. Anderson Cooper glanced at his notes, as if searching for an escape route. But the sparks were already flying too close to the powder keg. Anderson Cooper said, "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Denzel just said that people like you don't listen. What do you say to people who feel unheard by the very system you're part of?" AOC inhaled deeply, shoulders squaring as she locked her gaze back onto Denzel's. AOC said, I say I do listen. I knock doors. I hold town halls. But I also hold people accountable when they cross the line. And that line is real, Denzel. Denzel Washington's eyes narrowed, that preacher's cadence curling around every word like a warning. Denzel Washington said, Then be careful, Congresswoman, because when you draw that line too tight, you'll find the people on the other side aren't going to stay quiet. A hush fell again, thicker this time. Not the polite silence of a staged debate, but the hush of an audience realizing they'd just heard something they'd be arguing about for days. Anderson Cooper glanced at the floor producer off stage, who was now frantically signaling the countdown to break. But before the camera could fade out, Denzel leaned into his microphone, his words cutting the air like a blade. Denzel Washington said, We won't be silenced. And you'd better believe we're just getting started. The audience erupted, half in cheers, half in stunned gasps. The fault lines on full display as the screen faded to black for a commercial that no one would remember a second of. The studio lights snapped back on to a low buzz of tension, the audience whispering among themselves like they'd just witnessed a family fight no one could politely pretend away. Anderson Cooper leaned forward, his practiced calm strained thin as he tried to corral two opponents who were now past the point of gentle jabs. Anderson Cooper said, Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're here with Denzel Washington and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, debating free speech, dissent, and the lines we draw for public accountability. Before the break, Denzel said, We won't be silenced. Let's pick up there. Denzel sat back in his chair, fingers pressed together, his gaze never leaving AOC's eyes, like two chess players on the verge of tipping the board over. Denzel Washington said, I stand by every word, Anderson. People are sick of the so-called acceptable speech police. If you say the wrong thing, you're canceled. If you ask the wrong question, you're branded an enemy. AOC didn't blink. She lifted her folder, flipped it open, and began to read aloud, her voice clear as crystal and twice as cold. AOC said, Denzel, last week you told Variety that Hollywood insiders have blacklists for people who speak the truth. Do you think your truth is more important than the public good? That you get to define what's true? Denzel's laugh was a short, sharp bark that made a few audience members flinch. Denzel Washington said, What I think, Congresswoman, is that truth doesn't come with a party logo or a celebrity stamp. It comes from everyday people, and they're tired of you all acting like their voices don't count. A murmur rolled through the room. One woman in the second row whispered to her friend, Did he just call her out? But before the words could settle, AOC leaned in, her elbow planted, her eyes drilling holes through the glare. AOC said, I believe people's voices do count. But words can do harm when they spread lies, when they inflame hate. And when you stand up here and say, we won't be silenced, what you're really doing is encouraging people who want to destroy civil discourse. Denzel pointed at her with an open hand, not accusatory, but unflinchingly direct. Denzel Washington said, No, what I'm doing is reminding them that they have a right to disagree with you and not be labeled monsters for it. Anderson Cooper jumped in, his eyes darting to the control room where the floor producer was frantically scribbling new notes. Anderson Cooper said, Let's get specific. Denzel, what exactly are you saying is off-limits now? Give me an example. Denzel's tone turned softer, but somehow that made his words cut deeper. Denzel Washington said, You want an example, Anderson? A teacher gets fired because they question a new policy. A parent gets banned from a school board meeting because they raise concerns about what's taught to their kids. Or an actor, someone like me, says maybe we should listen to both sides, and suddenly you're a conspiracy theorist. How is that free speech? A few in the audience clapped, but the rest sat rigid, some crossing their arms, some looking at the floor. AOC flipped another page in her folder, her pen tapping in a staccato rhythm that betrayed her calm. AOC said, "And how many people have been harmed by so-called both sides? Look at COVID misinformation. Look at election conspiracies. People died, Denzel. People stormed the Capitol. Is that the dissent you're protecting?" Denzel's eyes flashed, not rage, but something deeper, older, like a storm bank rolling in. Denzel Washington said, "No. I'm protecting the people who get lumped in with that because they ask questions. Because they say, wait a minute, does this make sense?" And your answer is always to shut them up. Anderson Cooper held up a hand, but it was too late. The studio audience was fully alive now, split like a fault line, voices rising, some clapping for Denzel, others shouting, "Facts matter," in support of AOC. AOC leaned back, her voice calm again, but now lined with steel. AOC said, "Dissent is American, but so is accountability. And if you think you can keep saying whatever you want with zero consequences, you don't understand how democracy works." Denzel leaned in so close that for a heartbeat, it looked like he might stand up. His voice was low, deliberate, each word striking the table like a drumbeat. Denzel Washington said, "Democracy works when people can speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient for you." The audience erupted, the studio echoing with the ragged tension of a room that had just realized this was no longer a debate, but a reckoning. Offstage, producers scrambled, the word viral already whispered like a spell that couldn't be taken back. Anderson Cooper's voice rose above the din, his face tight with the effort of holding it all together. Anderson Cooper said, "We're going to try to take some audience questions after the break, if we can." But everyone watching, in the room, at home, on the phones lighting up in trembling hands, knew the break would do nothing to cool what had been set ablaze. The break did nothing. It only made the tension feel more suffocating when the lights flickered back on. In the studio, you could see it in the audience's posture, backs stiff, hands white-knuckled around cell phones that kept recording no matter what the floor manager begged. Anderson Cooper's voice cracked ever so slightly as he spoke over the hum of whispered arguments. Anderson Cooper said, "We're back with Denzel Washington and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We've promised to take a few audience questions, so let's go right to it." A young man stood up near the aisle, his voice shaking but clear enough to echo through the tense room. Audience members said, "This is for both of you. Don't you think this whole debate shows exactly why people feel hopeless? You're both right about some things, but it feels like nobody's listening to each other." Denzel's eyes softened for the briefest moment. He nodded, once, a gesture that somehow felt like a bow to the man's frustration. Denzel Washington said, "You're right. We're talking at each other instead of to each other. But people need to hear that it's okay to disagree, that it's okay to question authority, whoever holds it." AOC pressed her lips together, her foot tapping out a restless beat under the table. She leaned forward, her voice quieter now, but every word laced with the same fire she'd held back since the first minute. AOC said, "Dissent matters. But so do facts. So does protecting people from lies that hurt real families. If we don't draw the line somewhere, then what's left is chaos." Denzel's reply came so quickly, it cut her off before the last syllable faded. Denzel Washington said, "What's left is freedom, and the risk that comes with it. Freedom is messy. It's uncomfortable. It's people saying things you hate, but you defend their right to say them." A few in the audience clapped, but the sound was hesitant, the air too thick with the gravity of the moment. Another hand shot up, this time a middle-aged woman with a pin that read "Moms for Truth." Audience members said, "Mr. Washington, do you think you're being silenced? You're one of the most famous actors in the world." Denzel's laugh was tired but real, a bark of something that sounded like relief. Denzel Washington said, "You're right. I have a platform. But when I use it to say something you don't want to hear, the attacks come fast. I can handle it. But what about people who can't? Who don't have the money, the fame, the lawyers? Who stands up for them?" AOC shifted, her arms folding tight across her chest, as if she could hold in the words she wanted to fling like knives. But instead, she forced her voice calm, lawyer precise, all edge and no heat. AOC said, I stand up for them. But I won't stand by while lies spread like poison. That's not accountability. That's neglect. Denzel leaned forward again, that preacher's rhythm back in every word. Denzel Washington said, what you call poison, Congresswoman, is often just a question you don't want asked. The room went silent again. Not polite, but stunned, like everyone was bracing for the next line that could break the whole thing wide open. Anderson Cooper glanced at his notes, realized they were useless now, and simply closed the folder in front of him. Anderson Cooper said, we're out of time for questions tonight, but I think we all know this conversation won't end here. AOC's hands trembled just slightly on the table edge, but her voice was steady as she looked straight at Denzel. No teleprompter, no spin. AOC said, you're right about one thing, Denzel. Freedom is messy, but if it costs our truth, our safety, our democracy, it's not freedom anymore. Denzel nodded once, a thin smile curling at the corner of his mouth. Denzel Washington said, and if your version of safety means shutting people up, that's not democracy. That's control. And we won't be silenced. The cameras zoomed out. The audience caught mid-clap, mid-shout, mid-phone recording, the roar impossible to separate into sides anymore. On social media, clips of Denzel's final line began circulating before the credits even rolled. Hashtag We Won't Be Silenced trended next to hashtag Denzel vs. OC. The battle lines redrawn every few scrolls. Some headlines called it a meltdown. Some called it a masterclass. Comment sections filled with people quoting both. Freedom is messy against, if it costs our truth, it's not freedom. Nobody agreed on who'd won, but everybody agreed they'd never seen a debate like this on live TV before. After the broadcast, Denzel didn't stay for the backstage glad-handing. He stepped into a waiting SUV, phone blowing up with texts from fellow actors and everyday people alike. Union workers, retired teachers, teenagers in dorm rooms whispering to each other, "Did you see Denzel tonight?" AOC stayed in her dressing room longer than usual, rewatching the clips already bouncing across Twitter, bracing for the threats, the noise, the fight to spin her side of the story, the fight she'd been born into long before she'd ever stood behind a congressional podium. And in living rooms across America, people argued at kitchen tables, in group chats, in the comments under half-baked TikToks, replaying that single promise again and again, we won't be silenced. Because no matter which side you were on, you felt it. In that studio, two unstoppable forces collided. Truth versus trust, freedom versus fear, and left behind a question nobody could answer in a single debate. How loud do you have to be before someone finally hears you?